This is the real case of Marcos Matsunaga, 2012, São Paulo, Brazil. He was a 42-year-old executive at the food company Yoki, brutally murdered by his wife, Elise Matsunaga. In May 2012, after a heated argument over infidelity, Elise shot Marcos at close range, dismembered his body into 6 parts, and abandoned the remains in plastic bags by a roadside. The crime shocked Brazil, and in 2016, Elise was sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison for aggravated homicide. The following images are generated with AI to illustrate the story. In the bustling city of São Paulo, where towering skyscrapers and endless avenues hide stories of power, wealth, and betrayal, a case would soon emerge that would shock not only Brazil, but the entire world. This was not just any crime. It was a story that combined the glamour of high society, the shadows of hidden secrets, and a chilling descent into one of the most brutal homicides the nation had ever witnessed. At the center of it all was a man of fortune and legacy, Marcos Matsunaga, the 42-year-old executive of Yoki, a food empire that had become a household name across Brazil. To the outside world, Marcos seemed untouchable, a successful businessman, heir to a vast family fortune, and living in a luxurious penthouse apartment with his wife and young daughter. But beneath the polished surface of wealth, something much darker was brewing. His wife, Elise Matsunaga, then just 30 years old, came from a vastly different background. She was intelligent, striking, and had met Marcos years earlier in circumstances that were anything but traditional. Their relationship, marked from the beginning by passion and imbalance, was also tainted by suspicion, jealousy, and control. While Marcos projected the image of a dedicated family man, his private life told a different story, one of affairs, betrayals, and a deep rift growing between him and the woman who once adored him. On May 19, 2012, the Matsunagas' lives appeared on the surface to continue as usual. That Saturday evening, Marcos, Elise, their infant daughter, and the child's nanny arrived at their luxury apartment in São Paulo. The nanny departed shortly after, leaving only the couple and the child inside the apartment. It was in this seemingly ordinary moment behind closed doors that the quiet mask of their life began to shatter. Elise, already tormented by suspicions of Marcos's infidelity, confronted him directly. The air grew tense, arguments escalated, and what began as a marital dispute would soon spiral into violence beyond imagination. Around 7:30 p.m., cameras in the building captured Marcos heading downstairs to pick up a pizza delivery. Those grainy security images would later become haunting, the last recorded moments of the businessman alive. When he returned, a storm of words, accusations, and insults filled the apartment. According to Elisa, Marcos not only denied her confrontation, but threatened her emotionally, even invoking the name of their daughter in his outburst. To Elisa, these words were the breaking point. Fueled by anger, fear, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal, she would later confess to taking a pistol, aiming at her husband's head, and pulling the trigger. The shot was quick, brutal, final. A man who had spent his life building an empire and cultivating influence was gone in an instant, slain not by a stranger or a rival, but by the woman who shared his bed. Yet the horror of that night was only just beginning. Elise, staring at the lifeless body of her husband, made a choice that would cement this case as one of the most infamous in Brazil's history. Instead of calling the authorities or admitting what she had done, she embarked on a path that blurred the line between desperation and cold calculation. The hours that followed would transform a tragic act into a crime so chilling it still echoes today. The silence that followed the gunshot must have been deafening. Inside the luxury apartment, Elise stood face to face with the unthinkable. Her husband, the heir of Yoki, dead at her hands. But it was not only death that marked this crime. It was the decision that followed, a decision that would transform an act of rage into one of the most gruesome and unforgettable stories in Brazilian criminal history. Instead of surrendering or calling for help, Elise chose a path of concealment. She dragged Marcos's lifeless body into a room, her mind racing with fear of the future. What would happen to her daughter, to the empire her husband represented? Those questions would lead her to a course of action that would horrify investigators and fascinate the public. In the hours after the shooting, Elise retrieved a knife. Her plan was simple in thought but monstrous in execution: dismember the body to make it disappear. Step by step, she divided the man she once loved into 6 parts, a process that was as methodical as it was chilling. She placed each piece into plastic bags, wrapping and sealing them as though packaging away the evidence of her crime. These bags were then hidden inside 3 large suitcases. The very image of a woman, elegant and poised in public life, dragging heavy luggage through her building's corridors, would soon become iconic, a haunting contrast between appearances and reality. By the morning of May 20th, 2012, Elise had steeled herself for the next phase of her plan. At 11:30 a.m., surveillance footage showed her leaving the building, pulling the 3 suitcases with visible strain. To neighbors or staff, it may have seemed like an ordinary scene, a woman carrying luggage, perhaps preparing for a trip. But inside those bags lay the dismembered remains of one of the most prominent businessmen in São Paulo. Elise drove until she reached a desolate roadside area in Cotia, a quiet region just outside the city. There she abandoned the bags, scattering the evidence of her crime in a desperate attempt to erase what had happened the night before. Days later, the gruesome discovery shocked local authorities. Passers-by noticed the plastic bags discarded along the roadside. What they found inside defied belief: human remains, cut and placed with cold precision. The horror of the discovery spread quickly, and soon the police were working to piece together whose body they had found. The story gained momentum in the media, with speculation swirling about the identity of the victim. When investigators confirmed that the remains belonged to Marcos Matsunaga, the case erupted into the headlines. A prominent businessman, heir to a billion-dollar empire, had vanished from his luxurious life, only to be found in pieces on a roadside. As suspicion grew, detectives turned their attention to the last person to see Marcos alive: his wife, Elise. Security cameras became crucial evidence, showing the exact timeline of Marcos leaving to pick up pizza and never being seen again. The contrast between those ordinary moments on camera and the grim reality of his fate only deepened the sense of tragedy. The trail of evidence began to close in on Elise, whose calm demeanor in public began to crumble under pressure. By June 4th, 2012, less than a month after the murder, she was arrested. Her confession would stun investigators. Not only had she killed Marcos, but she had also carried out the dismemberment herself. This revelation turned the Matsunaga case into an international sensation. Newspapers and TV channels dissected every detail, from the couple's marriage troubles to the shocking brutality of Elise's actions. What had driven a wife and mother to such extremes? Was it betrayal, fear, greed, or something far darker? These questions fueled endless debates, and as the legal process unfolded, the world would come to see just how complex and disturbing this story truly was. As the investigation unfolded, the portrait of the Matsunaga marriage came into sharp focus, and it was far from the picture-perfect image the couple had projected to the world. Behind the doors of their lavish penthouse, arguments simmered, suspicions grew, and resentment quietly accumulated, like pressure in a sealed container waiting to explode. Elise, in her confession, described years of feeling humiliated and betrayed. She alleged that Marcos had a pattern of infidelity, that she discovered he was cheating once again, and that this latest betrayal had driven her to confront him on the night of May 19, 2012. But prosecutors argued that what happened went far beyond the emotions of a scorned spouse. It was, in their words, cold-blooded murder. The case captured the public because it contained all the ingredients of a modern-day tragedy: wealth, betrayal, power, and a shocking act of violence. Marcos was not just any man. He was the executive of Yoki, a brand that had been a staple in Brazilian households for decades. To many, his death represented more than the end of one life. It symbolized the collapse of a dynasty's heir. The sensationalism grew with every headline, every news report, every new revelation about what went on behind the Matsunaga's closed doors. The more the media uncovered, the more disturbing the narrative became. Forensic experts pieced together the sequence of events with chilling precision. The gunshot wound was to the head, delivered at close range. Marcos likely had no chance to defend himself. The dismemberment, investigators noted, was not done hastily in panic, but rather with an eerie sense of calculation. The body was divided cleanly, each part placed deliberately into bags. It was the kind of detail that led prosecutors to claim this was not a crime of sudden passion, but of deliberate cruelty. And yet, Elise maintained she acted in the heat of the moment, fueled by rage after years of emotional turmoil. The public was divided. Some saw her as a victim of a controlling and unfaithful husband, a woman who finally broke under the weight of betrayal. Others viewed her as a manipulative figure who had plotted her husband's death for personal gain, perhaps eyeing his wealth and inheritance. This polarization only amplified the case's notoriety. Television talk shows, newspapers, and online forums debated endlessly. Was Elise a monster or a desperate woman pushed too far? Meanwhile, the police built a timeline that left little room for doubt. The security cameras showed Marcos alive at 7:30 p.m., collecting a pizza. After that, he vanished. The following morning, Elise was seen struggling with heavy suitcases. Days later, the remains were found in Cotia. Each piece of evidence clicked together, forming a puzzle with only one conclusion. Elise had killed her husband, dismembered him, and attempted to dispose of his body. The sheer brutality of it kept the public riveted, horrified, yet unable to look away. By the time Elise was formally charged, the case had become a media circus. Every court appearance was broadcast, every new detail dissected. The Matsunaga name, once associated with family tradition and success, now carried the weight of scandal and death. And as the trial date loomed closer, anticipation reached fever pitch. What punishment would await the woman who had confessed to ending the life of one of Brazil's most prominent heirs? The answer would come years later, but first, the courtroom would become the stage for one of the most unforgettable trials in the country's legal history. When the trial of Elise Matsunaga finally began, years after the crime, the courtroom transformed into a theater of high drama. Every seat was filled, every camera focused, and every word spoken was dissected by a nation hungry for answers. For prosecutors, this was a case of premeditated murder, carried out with a cruelty that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. They painted Elise not as a desperate wife reacting in the heat of the moment, but as a cold and calculating killer who executed her husband, dismembered him with chilling precision, and attempted to erase his existence from the world. To them, the motive was clear: resentment, anger, and possibly financial gain. Elise's defense team fought fiercely to counter this narrative. They described her not as a monster, but as a victim, an emotionally battered woman who had endured years of betrayal. They argued that on the night of May 19, 2012, she reached a breaking point after discovering Marcos's latest affair. According to their version, the fatal gunshot was not the result of planning, but of overwhelming passion and desperation. Her subsequent decision to dismember the body, they claimed, was not born of cruelty, but of sheer panic and fear of losing custody of her daughter. This battle of narratives, calculated killer versus tormented wife, became the centerpiece of the trial. The forensic evidence, however, was undeniable. Experts testified that the single gunshot was delivered at close range, leaving Marcos with no chance to react. The condition of the body suggested calm and deliberate action rather than chaotic panic. Prosecutors emphasized this as proof that Elise knew exactly what she was doing. They also highlighted her actions after the crime, driving to Cotia, disposing of the suitcases, and returning home as though nothing had happened, as further evidence of her composure and intent. Witnesses were called to the stand, from forensic specialists to family members, each adding new layers to the already complex portrait of the Matsunaga's life together. The media seized on every detail. Headlines blared with phrases like "the butcher of São Paulo" and "the Yoki murder." Commentators debated endlessly on television, their voices echoing into living rooms across the nation. The case had transcended the courtroom. It had become a cultural phenomenon, a modern morality play about love, betrayal, and the darkest corners of the human psyche. Finally, after days of testimony and arguments, the jury was called to deliver its verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman read the decision: guilty of qualified homicide. The qualifiers were damning: motivo torpo, a vile motive; meo cruel, a cruel method; and the impossibility of defense for the victim. On December 5, 2016, Elise Matsunaga was sentenced to 19 years, 11 months, and 1 day in prison. The verdict reverberated across Brazil. Some celebrated it as justice served. Others questioned whether the sentence truly captured the complexity of the case. But one fact was indisputable. The Matsunaga name, once tied to success and prosperity, would forever be remembered for blood, betrayal, and tragedy. The case did not end there. Its echoes would continue to haunt Brazilian culture for years to come, inspiring documentaries, books, and endless speculation about what truly happened inside that luxurious penthouse on that fateful night. Because beneath the verdict, beneath the sensationalism, one chilling question remained unanswered. What truly drove a wife and mother to cross the line from betrayal to murder? In the aftermath of the conviction, Brazil was left grappling with a case that seemed larger than life. The trial had ended, the sentence was clear, but the fascination with Elise Matsunaga and the brutal fate of her husband was far from over. Journalists, psychologists, and criminologists all attempted to dissect the layers of this crime. Was it a tragedy of passion, a sudden explosion of anger that spiraled into horror? Or was it, as prosecutors maintained, a carefully orchestrated plan by a woman who had grown tired of her husband's betrayals and wanted to claim her share of his wealth? The public was divided. On one side, there were those who saw Elise as a victim of her circumstances, trapped in a marriage with a powerful man who allegedly controlled, manipulated, and humiliated her. To them, the gunshot represented the desperate act of a woman pushed beyond her limits. On the other side stood those who saw her as nothing less than a cold-blooded killer who not only executed her husband, but also dismembered him with chilling calmness, later attempting to conceal the crime as though erasing a human life were no different than discarding trash. This polarization kept the case alive in headlines long after the court's gavel fell. Meanwhile, the symbolism of the crime scene took on a life of its own. The pizza Marcos collected at 7:30 p.m. became more than just a detail. It was the final moment of normalcy before the horror began. The luxury apartment, once a symbol of success and privilege, was now remembered as a chamber of violence. And the heavy suitcases, dragged by Elise through the halls, were etched into the collective imagination as the haunting image of her attempt to hide the truth. These objects, mundane in any other context, were now forever associated with betrayal, murder, and dismemberment. The trial also opened a deeper conversation about gender, power, and violence in Brazilian society. Was Elise another example of a woman silenced and dismissed until she snapped? Or was she exploiting narratives of victimhood to mask an act of calculated brutality? Television debates and newspaper editorials reflected this cultural clash, with some commentators defending her as a woman who endured humiliation, while others condemned her as a manipulator who used her intelligence and charm to mask her darker side. As years passed, documentaries and true crime series revisited the Matsunaga case. The most notable was Netflix's Elise Matsunaga, Once Upon a Crime, which gave Elise herself a platform to tell her version of events. The series reignited public interest, sparking new discussions about the reliability of her narrative and the mystery of what truly unfolded in those final hours. Elise's calm and often detached demeanor during interviews added to the enigma. Was this the voice of someone finally at peace with her actions, or the tone of someone still playing a role to the cameras? Even today, the story refuses to fade. It remains a cautionary tale of how love can curdle into resentment, how betrayal can morph into rage, and how in a single night a family dynasty can collapse under the weight of violence. For some, the lesson is about control and abuse. For others, it is about greed and cruelty. But no matter the perspective, the Matsunaga case endures as a haunting reminder of the fragile line between passion and destruction. As the years stretched on inside the cold walls of prison, Elise Matsunaga remained an enigma. Unlike many convicted criminals who fade into obscurity, her name continued to dominate headlines, interviews, and debates. The media's fascination was relentless, not only because of the brutality of her crime, but also because of the contradictions she embodied. She was at once a grieving widow and a confessed killer, a mother longing for her daughter and a woman condemned for destroying her family. Every new glimpse into her life behind bars reignited curiosity and controversy. Her daughter, just a toddler at the time of Marcos's death, became the silent victim of this tragedy. Custody battles ensued, with family members stepping in to protect the child from the shadows of her parents' story. For many Brazilians, this was the most heartbreaking detail of all. A young girl growing up without her father and separated from her mother, her childhood forever marked by the infamy of her parents' names. This tragic innocence at the heart of the case served as a painful reminder that the consequences of that single gunshot reached far beyond Marcos and Elise. Meanwhile, the broader Matsunaga family struggled with the fallout. For a dynasty tied to one of Brazil's most iconic brands, the scandal was devastating. Although Yoki itself was later sold to an international conglomerate, the brand could not fully escape the shadow of the crime. Business analysts noted that while the company's products remained on supermarket shelves, the name Matsunaga had become synonymous not with food and tradition, but with betrayal and death. The ripple effect of the case proved that even private crimes could permanently stain public legacies. Inside prison, Elise became a symbol of paradox. Reports emerged that she studied law, worked in the prison sewing shop, and even offered legal assistance to other inmates. These stories painted her as a woman trying to rebuild some semblance of identity, perhaps to soften her public image, or perhaps as a genuine attempt at redemption. Yet every time she appeared in interviews or documentaries, her calm, composed tone unsettled audiences. Viewers wondered, was this the voice of remorse, or the detachment of someone who had long justified her actions to herself? The Netflix documentary Elise Matsunaga, Once Upon a Crime, took this fascination to a new level. It gave her a stage to narrate her life, from her modest beginnings to her marriage with Marcos, and finally, the crime itself. The series drew millions of viewers worldwide, sparking heated debates on social media. Some argued it gave her too much of a platform, allowing her to humanize herself in the public eye. Others saw it as a rare chance to understand the psychology of a woman who crossed the ultimate line. What was undeniable was that the fascination endured, proof that the Matsunaga case had transcended crime and become part of cultural memory. Through it all, one haunting fact remained. No matter how many explanations, confessions, or defenses were offered, no one but Elise truly knew what happened in the minutes leading up to the murder. Was it a moment of blind fury? Or had she decided long before that night that Marcos would never leave the apartment alive? That uncertainty is what continues to keep the story alive, a chilling reminder that the deepest secrets often vanish with the people who carry them. Even with a verdict delivered and years of prison time served, the Matsunaga case continued to evolve, shaping itself into something more than a crime story. It became a cultural mirror, reflecting Brazil's struggles with wealth inequality, gender dynamics, and the fragile nature of power within families. For many, the tale of Marcos and Elise was not just about a murder, it was about what happens when love, money, and betrayal collide in the shadows of privilege. The symbolic weight of the case remained heavy. Journalists often returned to the smallest details that had shocked the nation. The image of Marcos walking calmly through his building lobby, pizza box in hand, moments before his death. The luxury apartment, a penthouse perched above São Paulo's glittering skyline, transformed in the public imagination into a stage for horror. The 3 heavy suitcases dragged through the corridors became symbols of guilt too heavy to carry, yet impossible to discard. And the lonely roadside in Cotia, where passers-by stumbled upon bags filled with body parts, became a place forever etched into Brazil's criminal history. The case also raised questions about justice and punishment. With her sentence set at nearly 20 years, many debated whether it was enough for the magnitude of the crime. Supporters of Elise argued she was paying for a lifetime of humiliation, and prison had already taken away her freedom, her reputation, and her daughter. Critics, however, believed her sentence was too lenient, considering the brutality of her actions and the cold precision of the dismemberment. This divide turned the Matsunaga trial into a touchstone for broader debates about the Brazilian justice system. Meanwhile, the story gained international attention. True crime enthusiasts across the globe dissected the details, astonished by the mix of wealth, betrayal, and savagery. Articles were published in major outlets, podcasts analyzed every timeline, and television specials kept the story alive. The fascination lay in the contrasts: the wealthy executive whose life ended in such a gruesome way, the beautiful wife who transformed into a confessed killer. The empire of food products juxtaposed against the darkest form of human violence. It was a story that transcended borders because it carried universal themes of love gone wrong, secrets unearthed, and the thin line between passion and destruction. Elise herself remained at the center of it all. In interviews, she often spoke with measured calmness, sometimes even with a tone of sorrow, yet rarely displaying the raw emotion people expected. Was this composure a mask? Or was it the final proof of her ability to compartmentalize, to separate herself from the horror of what she had done? That ambiguity only deepened the mystery. As the years passed, one thing became clear: the Matsunaga case would not fade into obscurity. It had cemented itself in Brazil's collective memory, much like infamous cases in other countries that continue to haunt long after the verdict. It was not only the crime itself, but the story behind it, the rise and fall of a family, the fracture of trust, and the irreversible step from betrayal to bloodshed that ensured this case would endure. In the end, the story of Marcos and Elise Matsunaga became more than a crime report. It became a modern parable about the fragility of human bonds and the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. For Marcos, his legacy was forever severed from the empire he helped lead. No one remembered him only as the heir of Yoki anymore. He was the man who vanished from his own life in the most brutal of ways. For Elise, her name became a synonym for contradiction, a woman who once seemed like the perfect wife and mother, yet whose actions turned her into one of the most notorious figures in Brazil's criminal history. The fascination endures because of the questions left unanswered. Was Elise truly the victim of years of emotional abuse and betrayal, pushed to a breaking point? Or was she, as prosecutors claimed, driven by greed and resentment, willing to eliminate her husband to secure her own future? The truth lies somewhere in the gray space between passion and calculation, between desperation and intent. And because only she knows what truly burned inside her in those final moments, the case continues to echo with mystery. But beyond the courtroom battles, beyond the debates on guilt and motive, lies the deepest tragedy of all. A young girl, their daughter, growing up without either parent. She lost her father to violence and her mother to prison, condemned to carry the weight of a story she never chose to be part of. For many, this child embodies the cruelest consequence of the Matsunaga case, the innocents caught in the crossfire of betrayal and bloodshed. Even now, a decade later, the symbolic images linger like fragments of a nightmare. The pizza box carried by Marcos in his final hours, the glittering penthouse-turned crime scene, the suitcases dragged through the hall like anchors of guilt, and the desolate roadside where his remains were found, all have become ghostly reminders that ordinary objects can transform into eternal symbols of horror. True crime documentaries, books, and endless discussions ensure the story remains alive, retold for new audiences who gasp at its brutality. For Brazil, it is a story that will never fully vanish because it represents not only the violence of a single night, but also the collapse of trust, love, and family under the weight of betrayal. And so, the Matsunaga case lingers in memory, a chilling reminder that behind even the most polished images of success and happiness, shadows can grow until they consume everything, a reminder that passion can mutate into destruction, and above all, a reminder that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can make us vanish.